this video, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the voice leading guidelines that will govern a lot of the way that we put our music together when we start to string one chord after another, after another, after another. Now, we are at the point where we have enough general background information. We have looked at independent individual chords. We've taken triads and we've written them in 4 parts. We've taken seventh chords, we've written them in 4 parts. We've looked at some basic figured bass. We know if we saw figured bass for a root position chord, we understand what that would mean, how we could create a chord from a figured bass starting point. So we've got a lot of basic information that we need in order to be able to start stringing these chords together to create a progression, as we call it, where we would start on one chord and move to another chord from within the scale, to another chord in the scale, to another chord, probably eventually ending up back on the home chord, starting and finishing on the tonic chord, moving away from it and then coming back to it. And we're going to look at how we do that. But right before we get to that, we need a couple more basic guiding principles. The first of those is to talk about the guiding principles, the guidelines for voice leading. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is you are going to start to write out for yourself chords in 4 parts. For example, you might have this chord. It's a straightforward C major chord. You are then going to want to move that chord to another chord. It won't be another C chord, it might be a 5 chord, or it might be a 6 chord, or some other chord in the key of C major. When you do that, there's going to be an implication that each of these voice parts, the soprano, the alto, the tenor, and the bass, are going to be moving to other notes. And as they move to other notes on through, so you're going to have essentially 2 things happening. You're going to have harmony occurring this way, like this one chord to another chord here, to another chord here, creating harmonic progressions where you could stop at any moment and say, this is a 1 chord, this is a 6 chord, this is a 2 chord, whatever it might be. And you can go through and identify them as harmony. But you're also going to have melodies occurring this way. And those melodies are important. The way you move, not just from chord to chord, but in each voice part, the way you move to the notes of that next chord, and then to the notes of the chord after that, and then to the notes of the chord after that. The way you move from note to note to note in each voice part is important. And there are 3 basic guidelines that you need to be aware of for voice leading. And they are these, and they are in a particular order. The first guideline is, if you can repeat a note, do so. That is to say, if there is a note in common between the chord you are on and the chord you are moving to, keep that note in common. Don't move a note if you don't have to. The second of the voice leading guidelines is move by step. However, you only move by step if you can't repeat a note. Do you see how this works? That the first guideline is always the one in play. If you can't do that, then you move to the second guideline. If you can't do that, then you move to the third guideline. So the first, repeat a note if you can. If you can't repeat a note, then move by step. That is to say, instead of repeating a note, because perhaps this note E doesn't exist in the chord you're going to. So if you can't repeat a note, move down by step or move up by step. Try and not move by more than a step in one direction or another to the adjacent note above or below. However, if you cannot do that, if you cannot repeat a note and if you cannot move by step, then move by the smallest possible leap. So you can't move by, you can't retain a note because the E is not in the chord you're going to. You can't move by step because neither is the D or the F in the chord that you're going to. So therefore move by the smallest leap. If the choice is to either leap up to an A or down to a C, you move down to a C because a C is a 1/3 away and the A is a 1/4 away. So you'll take the smallest leap. So the 3 voice leading guidelines are, if you can repeat a note, repeat a note. If you cannot repeat a note, move by step. If you cannot move by step, then move by the smallest possible leap. Those three guidelines are essentially the foundation for most of the harmonic progressions you will write. Now, as is often the case in music, these guidelines have to be used in context. You can't just apply the guidelines without knowing about a couple of other things that you should always avoid. We'll get to those in the next video. You also can't apply the guidelines without knowing a couple of other things about the way music operates in this time period. For example, you can't just apply the guidelines and write the chords next to each other without any regard to the fact that they make a good progression. In this time period, it is unusual that you would write a 1 chord go into a 2 chord, to a 3 chord, to a 4 chord. It is not common to have a lot of the same interval distance between the chords, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, all moving up by step. That would be unusual in this time period. So you can't apply the part writing guidelines and then say, well, I applied those, but obviously you didn't care about the conventions of what chord should or shouldn't follow another chord in this particular system of harmony. So all of these things, as I've said in earlier videos, all these things have to be kind of taken at the same time. You have to live in the fact that you're going to follow the guidelines, the part writing guidelines, but in the context of the guidelines and or the decisions you make about chord selection, inversions, all the other things that go into creating a good solid chord progression. So the 3 voice leading guidelines are important. You should learn them, you should employ them, but you should employ them in context. The other thing you should bear in mind, especially when in our first exercises we are going to be writing root position chords. We're only going to do that for a short while and then we'll start writing chords in inversion. But while we are writing chords in root position, you will find that the bass, because it is defining the chord, because it is always the root of the chord, it is going to leap around a little bit more. It's going to have a much wider. The other voices may be able to move by step or by repeating notes or by small leap or whichever the guidelines it might be that is most appropriate. You will be able to do that with most of the other voices as you write your progressions. But the bass will tend to leap around until we're able to introduce inversions. Once we get inversions into the mix, the bass can start to smooth out a little more and doesn't have to leap about quite as much. So in these first examples, it's perfectly fine for the bass to leap about a little bit. Try and keep the other voices as smooth as possible. Once we get into knowing about and understanding and using inversions, you'll find that naturally all the voice parts will smooth out. The bass still has a tendency to move, to leap around a little more than the other voices, but even at that, it will still be smoother, certainly, than when you are limited to just root position chords. So, this video is really just to go over those 3 guidelines to make sure that you've heard them and you've kind of heard them in the context of why we're doing it, about where we're talking about the harmony at any given point, and also we're talking about the way the chords move, the lines of music move, the internal melodies, if you will, of each part has to make sense and has to be has to move as smoothly as possible. So I wanted you to have that concept in your mind. With that as a background, we'll go into looking in the next video at a couple of things you're supposed to avoid, and then we'll be ready to move into actually voicing out and constructing some progressions of chords from one to another to another. Thank you.